First of all, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We've been looking forward to sharing the work that's been ongoing since the events last spring in California with EHV-1. And I'm sure everyone's tired of hearing that EHV is an endemic disease. And what that means, for those of you who may be a little bit more curious, is that EHV is constantly in the equine population. And it's not something that's going to be cured. It can only be managed, prevented, hopefully, and mitigated when we have cases that reach potentially an outbreak situation. Much of the focus is always going to be on the prevention and management of the disease from a herd perspective, to prevent other horses from developing clinical disease and transmitting to others. However, we will talk a little bit today also with the panelists about individual treatment of horses, what happened in the desert, and what may have been helpful. Bottom line is that EHV is here to stay, and we have to become to maintain or continually be vigilant in our identification of it, preventing sick horses from getting competitions and identifying when they're there. Excuse me. Today we have a variety of panelists who will talk a little bit about their experiences and their roles in preventing and managing EHV. Again, you can go ahead and advance the slide. Thank you. Just the agenda, some of the things we're going to talk about, what happened last year, what we've learned, how we can face this challenge together, the USDS perspective and support the competition and the competition's increased biosecurity measures, and then also what in general is known about EHV-1, the risk factors, outbreak prevention, and we're also going to hear about some new diagnostic techniques. So we do have someone handling the question portion of the webinar, and we'll be trying to answer questions as we go along as well. So you can send your questions in, and we will address them potentially as we go, depending upon time, but also we will be addressing them at the end. But first up, we can go ahead and advance the slide, please. First up, we have Steve Hankin, and Steve is the president and CEO of Desert International Horse Park, and he lived this last spring, and frankly, I think he has quite a bit of insight that will be helpful for most everyone. Steve?
Oh, thanks, Stephen. And good afternoon, everybody. The next slide. I will speak a little bit as shortly as I can, because there's certainly more people on the webinar who have a lot more expertise than I do, but I can give a little bit of perspective about what we faced and what we learned and what we're trying to do about it. I want to start off first by thanking a lot of people. It was obviously a difficult situation, and we had a lot of people who helped us through it and have helped us since. I owe a big thanks to my partners who, on the first day when this started, basically said spare no dollars and no effort in trying to get through this and treat horses as best as we could. We had great support from East West, Duncan and his team, and the folks at UC Davis and USEF, and so we had a lot of support to try to get through it as successfully as we possibly could. I'm far from an expert. I never dreamed of this when we made the decision to buy the horse park, and perhaps I should, but I didn't. It's easy to argue whether we were prepared or not prepared, and all of our words will be dissected. But my goal is to help continue to advance the knowledge in this and to advance the ability of horse shows to minimize and mitigate the risk of EHV-1. Just to give you some facts, we had about 1,800 horses on the property at the time. It is one of the largest horse parks in the United States. The first case that was confirmed was on Friday of week 4, around 11:30 in the morning, and the initial cases were positive for EHM. We through it, all had 29 positive cases on the property, 3 of which were EHM, and they were also the first 3 cases that we had. We did not report on, and I don't know the facts around cases that occurred outside of the horse park. There were a lot of decisions we made early on about what we would say or not say and what we would do. Some of them seemed to make sense. One of them was that we would report on what happened at the horse park and not elsewhere, because we didn't have any proprietary knowledge, and the state felt very strongly that it was their job to report what was happening in the state. So it's not to minimize the number of cases, but the only thing I really know about most is the cases on the property, and there were 29. We euthanized 1 horse, of which was the 3 that were EHM. I wrote here non-neuropathic strain. That became a bit of controversy, and I've learned a lot more since then. There are actually 3 strains, as Nicola has taught me, and all produce neurologic symptoms. And so the distinction, which early on meant something, I've learned actually doesn't mean a lot, because all 3 strains can produce neurologic characteristics. Important in California, the CDFA controls the quarantine once an EHM case is confirmed. They were great partners in this, Emily and Josh, but they do in the end make the final decisions about what occurs on the property once an EHM case. Interestingly enough, they don't have any say if the cases were only EHV-1. Collectively, we are under the state quarantine for 5.5 weeks. It seemed like 5.5 million years, but that was the length of time that we were under their control. So those are the basic facts about this. Next slide. We learned a lot, and everybody can say you can learn sooner. One thing I would say is that once you have a positive case, it's really late in the process. We, in the end, had an incubation period, which ran somewhere between 10 and 14 days, which means that the outbreak started during week 2. And it really wasn't until a case presented itself on the Thursday of week 4 that you really know that you have something that's brewing across the property. The majority of cases that did occur on the property were already exposed by the time you learn what's going on. So it's a little bit of a losing game the first week when you get started. The primary strategy is emphasized by the state is to identify and isolate as quickly as possible. It doesn't feel like a successful strategy. And certainly in the last 6 months, as Nicola and Duncan know, I've tried every which way to find an answer other than this. But really identifying and isolating as quickly as possible is the most important thing that you can do, because there's ultimately no way to prevent in any population of horses a case from occurring. This is probably many of the protocols written by the state or others are either outdated, nuanced, or don't reflect the facts on the ground. It is true that if you spend a lot of time reading all of the research, you'll find bits and pieces that you can put together. But no one, you find in a lot of the protocols or state documents or other, and not just California, reference to 5 to 7 days. Well, 5 to 7 days was the beginning of our incubation period, not really relevant. And 40% of our cases that had a negative test the first time tested positive subsequently. And while you can find those nuances around the place, it's not like someone gives you a manual the first day that says this is what you're dealing with. And there is a significant lack of fact base that is a real impediment to doing more in this disease in preventing it. So one of the reasons we're funding research at UC Davis, and you see UC Davis people running around the property, is that we're committed to continuing to learn about this. We had unlimited resources, and one of the things the state worried about was everybody would be able to do, is that our response couldn't be scaled at smaller facilities. But even with our resources, there were things that we wish we had on the property on the first minute, and we're certainly more prepared today. Next slide. John. Another thing we've learned is that you can always do things differently. It is hard to tell whether it would make a difference. We have a set of protocols new this year. And one of the things I've debated with UC Davis is when will we know whether they're successful? And they're like, you will never know if they're successful. We may have another outbreak at some point in time, we may not. And it's drawing a straight line between action and results and impact, it's very hard to do. Lastly, everyone has to collaborate and work together. There's no easy answer. I spent 4 months after the outbreak reading everything I could. And I would call UC Davis or Duncan or Steve Schumacher every day and say, what about this? What about that? There is no way to just say we can get rid of this. We would all like to. And so working together in terms of finding sick horses is really still the most important thing that can be done. And that's the basis for the protocols that we have. So that's a little bit of an introduction, and I'll pass this on to Duncan. I focus this. What are we doing different? A lot. First is education and awareness. We have signage. We've been putting out information. The goal of our protocols, which are very different now than they were, and our protocols have been reviewed and contributed by a lot of people, but also USEF. And what we have decided is that USEF and Desert International and Wellington would all have the same protocols this year so that we could learn from the large horse shows, and then they could figure out how to roll this out. But in the end, this is somewhat as simple as preventing sick horses from coming to the horse park and finding sick horses on the property as quickly as possible. So we have new protocols for arrival and during staying at the horse park. We have built an on-site lab for rapid testing, and we have more resources available to us. The one thing I'd say is I want to thank everybody who is at the horse park or was there the first 2 weeks. They were great, and the process worked really smoothly. And in some ways it did. It identified 3 febrile horses very early on. We followed the protocols, so those horses were tested almost immediately. And all of them tested negative. And had one of them tested positive, we would have been so much earlier on in the process than we would have without it. So, so I think we are learning, and it is making a difference. And I thank everybody for collaborating. So, Duncan.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And it was quite a spring last year in terms of dealing with that. That's for sure. And I would like to talk a little bit about the veterinary perspective of some of what we went through, but more importantly, where we go. I think it's always great to look back and try to piece things together, but it's always a moving forward type of motion we like. Next slide, please. And I think to start out with, from a veterinary perspective, trying to be proactive. I think biosecurity is real. It has to be real, and everyone has to buy into it in order to, protect these horses and what we're doing in terms of competition. They come from so many different areas to these events now, and they also travel long distances, are highly stressed, and really open the door to, unfortunately, incidents like this. So we all have to be aware that this is sort of the new world in terms of trying to protect our horses and our individuals. And all of us have a big investment in it, whether you're a horse owner or whether you're a competition manager in terms of wanting to compete. One of the big things is, as Steve brought up, is appreciating early recognition of problems and not just waving them off as, oh, that horse is tired, or that horse, he's always a little rough after shipping. Early recognition of fevers, I think, is probably the biggest thing we can do, and then having a protocol to just address that. It doesn't mean that we're going to go into full-blown isolation or full-blown Tyvek suits and call in the hazmat folks. It just means that we need to be aware, and we all need to be able to appreciate that, yes, horses do get sick, horses do get stressed, but we need to be good stewards and appreciate that and be able to deal with it with the people that have the knowledge and have the resources to be able to handle that. I think a lot of it is, again, recognizing abnormalities, appetite, attitude, movement by the people that are around the horses all the time. And many horse owners that are at the shows may not spend as much time with their horses as, say, the assistant trainers or the grooms in the barn. But we have to educate those people to say, hey, this horse isn't right, and let's get the people involved that can help with to solve a problem or at least deal with a problem that may be there. Again, being proactive, reporting of fevers and other abnormalities to show veterinarians and show management is imperative. If we don't know they're there, we can't help. We can't help put the process into effect and try to determine whether or not we have a problem. But to sweep it under the rug, I don't think it helps anyone. We need to get on these things early. So having a mechanism of being proactive to recognize that there's a problem and then letting people know is imperative. And then for us, from a veterinary standpoint, early examination and treatment intervention. I think in our incidents last winter, we made a commitment to say we're going to be aggressive in our treatment and not sit and wait and see what's going to happen. And I think that helped us. The first horses, as Steve mentioned, first one was neurologic, and we had one after that 4:30 in the afternoon was completely fine. By 8:30 in the evening, we put it to sleep because it had a severe problem. One of the problems with that also is that referral hospitals, in many cases, don't want to take these horses. They can't take these horses. They can't shut down theirs unless they have a good isolation facility or take the risk that they're going to expose patients that are already under stress to have a problem. So this can definitely jeopardize our abilities. Next slide, please. What do we do in this case? First off, I think for us as veterinarians, it's a clinical judgment. We have to make a rapid judgment as to, is this fever a true problem, or is it a fever from some other cause? And that is one thing we've been trying to sort of isolate and determine just by following the fevers that we get at horse shows. We also do the Michigan circuit in northern Michigan during the summer and did some testing up there and trying to appreciate, if the horse has a fever, what is the possibility that that's going to be EHV, and is it going to be possible a neurologic form? So clinical judgment and making a rapid assessment of, do we have to keep this horse in some type of isolation, or do we have to keep this horse away from other horses to try to minimize any spread? And testing has been a problem in the past. Most of these things seem to occur on Thursday nights or Fridays. And in many cases, it's very difficult to get things tested or get results back until the following Monday. So we're going to talk later about some on-site testing, and I think that's going to be sort of help in the future to try to isolate these things and at least give us some direction as to how we need to go. The samples we collect, nasal swabs, blood, most of the horses that we dealt with here, we looked at them first with just the SAA test, serum amyloid A, which is an inflammatory protein. And we, as we got going, we got a feel for what these horses were doing in terms of an inflammatory response. And it gave us a little insight as to what we may be looking at down the road, how aggressive we had to be with our treatment. Stall side, on-site testing, we did not have last winter. We're fortunate this fall to have that and to be able to use that. And we've already used it in these last 2 weeks at the Sunshine Circuit. And it's been very nice to have, and it gives us some direction as well as some peace of mind as to what we might be dealing with and how we need to proceed forward. I already mentioned that state labs, can be difficult sometimes in terms of getting a turnaround on some of these samples, but at this point in time, they are the ones that control, as Steve said, the quarantine and whether or not the show is put into some type of quarantine. So you do still have to have some official testing there. What did we do in terms of treating these horses? Well, the big thing for us was try to control the fever. We did that mostly with Banamine, some dipyrone. A lot of these horses went on IV fluids, some with or without DMSO, and that was sort of dependent on if they had some neurologic signs or some inclination of some neurologic conditions. And so initially we had those 2-3 horses that we dealt with that showed some signs. After that, we did not really treat horses with DMSO. One thing we did do is we used heparin and we used treated horses 2 to 3 twice a day, 2 to 3 days, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 international units. That became an issue. We could not get enough heparin for the horses that we were treating at one time. And we were going all over to try to get that covered for us. So having the resources available and having something stockpiled to be able to cover that is important. And I think Steve addressed that to some degree already. Valcyclovir was our drug of choice in terms of putting these horses on an antiviral. And we used a dose of 20 to 30 milligrams per kilogram, 2 to 3 times a day. Most of them had it twice a day, again, because it was very, very difficult to get a hold of. I think we pretty much all of Riverside County was out of Valtrex because of the horse situation at the horse park. And then we did try some supplementation also with lysine and zinc that Platinum Performance supplied, which was nice as an adjunct. Don't know for sure whether or not that made a difference in any of these horses, but there's some literature out there that suggests that it might be useful. And the big thing was for us during our treatment was to closely monitor these horses. Dr. Bidwell and Dr. Kelscher, they must have changed their clothes 10 times, 15 times a day to try to make sure when they were going to isolation that there wasn't anything being passed from one horse to another, and also to be able to monitor these horses and make adjustments as we needed to while they were in isolation or a pre-isolation state. Next slide, please. So moving forward, from a veterinary standpoint, I think Steve has touched on this, education, communication, and then some type of compliance. The hard thing is compliance. I think we definitely had some on-site education here at the horse park that worked very well. I think that's an ongoing process. And it's interesting because, you don't think it's going to happen to you, but if it does, then you're really interested in it. And unfortunately, a lot of us just aren't up to speed in some cases on what we have to do if an outbreak occurs. So, taking the time to read some of that material that AAP has out there, that USEF has out there, that the individual horse shows are now providing in their emails, I think is very important. The other thing about that is having some accountability and responsibility taken for the control of horses, say as a trainer, and being responsible to say that we need to teach our people, our grooms, our handlers, that looking for these signs and reporting these things and getting the information so that we can make appropriate decisions moving forward with horses that are sick. And that accountability and that responsibility is very important. And sometimes there's a little disconnect between that. So I think, there has to be some education as well as some responsibility taken from the individual barns and individual management of those horses that is helpful. One thing that we recognized that we did have some major compliance problems with isolation and biosecurity. We did have people at gates to try to keep people out, but there were times when people would walk in, sort of go in there and not gown up or not use the foot baths and so on and so forth. So, compliance of these things can make a big difference. And then the communication with show management, I think Steve has touched on this very well. The state veterinarians, if there's a quarantine situation. And then one thing we found at the horse park is that there's always a lot of rumors going around. And once Steve and his crew started sort of town hall meetings every day at noon, I think it was, all of a sudden people could ask the questions and they could bring up their concerns, and they were updated every day as to what the situation was, that a lot of those rumors were squelched and people, again, bought into the fact that we're all in this together. And I think that's a big part of it. So I really don't have anything else, and I will pass it on. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, that was really important what I was talking about too. But before you go, Duncan, real quick, we had a question about the initial tests that were done. I think Steve mentioned it, but Duncan may be better to respond. And that is that there are 40% of the first tests that were initially negative, subsequently tested positive. And the question was, what was the test that was performed initially?
The PCR test done by the state lab. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Duncan.
Yeah.
So everyone gets to listen to me a little bit more here. Looking at the time, I'm going to go through this relatively efficiently, just so we have time for the rest of our presenters, as well as some questions at the end. Next slide, please. First of all, I'm Stephen Schumacher, veterinarian, staff veterinarian for the United States Equestrian Federation. Generally, I run the Equine Drugs and Medications program, Equine Clean Sport. However, being the veterinarian here, I also am involved with the welfare and the disease consideration. So just a little bit about what USEF, what we did last year. I remember getting the call from Steve, I think it was February 9th or 11th of last spring. And we worked closely with Steve, with Duncan, as well as CDFA. They were great to work with, Dr. Nat Ziba there. And then what we did upon the completion, or I won't say completion, but when the outbreak had really curtailed and wound down, we did start some panel discussions with industry experts. We had some state veterinarians. We included researchers, veterinarians, competition organizers, and members from the Federation, just to discuss kind of what happened, what could we do better, that kind of thing. And many of the policies that are coming out for these two, the main two venues, Desert International Horse Park and down in Wellington WEF, those are going to be as a result of many of these panel discussions. First and foremost, the federations had a isolation plan requirement in place for a number of years, but it recognizes the fact that no two show venues or no two competition venues are identical. And so it was really important to get competition organizers invested and involved in this. And I can tell you that Steve at Desert International and David at Wellington, David Burton, they've both been through the fire. And so I think once you've experienced that, then you become very, very sensitive to it. And I think a lot of great discussion came from individuals who've had to deal with this on a firsthand basis. What the Federation also did then was we funded and supported some research at UC Davis. I can tell you that other people also chipped in immensely. And really it was a collaborative effort. I'm sure there's some more information that we can talk about later, not in this venue, about some of the results of that research that would be interesting for everyone. The Federation also helped to develop recently an online vaccination health certificate submission platform. And this was initially intended for Desert International Horse Park and Wellington International. But we've actually opened it up to the rest of the membership. And so people can go and get on their horse link and upload their vaccine submissions as well as their health certificates. Also, we've assisted in relationships with Fluxergy. Fluxergy is a company that has developed some PCR testing, on-site PCR testing that they had a relationship actually with Dr. Pasterla and work with Steve this summer and the like, and we've actually we've included Wellington in their relationship. But what's important to remember, and I think Duncan touched on as well, is that this test is not going to be substituted for the state regulatory test. However, it provides additional information much quicker and to help make decisions upon what to do with some horses with fevers. It's not intended to substitute or eliminate that state testing, which is a requirement. And then also, the Federation, in reviewing the protocols, is strongly supportive of both of these, the biosecurity measures of both of these venues that are coming forth. And we're looking to see rolling it out to these two large venues that have a lot of horses on it during a very, I want to say, sensitive time of year, late winter, early spring. It's very, very important to see what works, what helps, what can be rolled out, and what can be applied to other competitions across the country under Federation rules. And that's what we'll be looking for closely. And then lastly, I think very, very importantly, the Federation recognizes that we need to assist and support competition management in the enforcement of these biosecurity measures that they're implementing. When we have members who are not pulling their weight, they're not adhering to the biosecurity measures, isolation protocols that are in place, requirement, they will be, essentially violating USEF rules, and we will be supporting the competitions and enforcing those. So I would encourage everyone, I think the message has been that we're all in this together, and we all have to be proactive to try and prevent the spread of disease. And so hopefully we can all join in and not have to be held accountable. But that is my part of it. Next up, we have, next slide, please. We have Dr. Nicola Pasterla with UC Davis. and he will be talking about the EHV-1. It's kind of the summary of last year's outbreak, risk factors and challenges, and for outbreak prevention. Dr. Pasterla.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm first of all a clinician. I get to see these cases referred to the hospital, but I also enjoy to some extent research. I feel that with every single outbreak that we get, as devastating as they are, that's a unique opportunity to gain information that potentially can help us down the road to prevent future outbreak. You will hear a lot of the same message: education, communication, biosecurity, and monitoring. We're not repeating that because we're all senile. We're repeating that because that's probably the only way we can get over this. Outbreaks are here to stay. If you put in 1,800 horses for several weeks in a winter time, these are young performance horses in the same environment, it's a matter of when and where. And we're only talking about EHV-1. And believe me, the list of infectious pathogen is long. So my point is, the areas where we can intervene is in the message that are continuously repeated, where everybody can buy in biosecurity, in monitoring, but it only works if everybody, sticks with the program. So what I've been given is 5 minutes to give you a little bit of insight on EHV-1. EHV-1 is not the bad monster we're trying to make it. So I'm going to talk quickly about EHV-1 and how it translates to the neurological form of EHV-1 infection. Talk a little bit about the California outbreak that we experienced this year in the winter, spring of 2022. Talk about risk factor, the challenges, and how we move into prevention. So first of all, EHV-1 and EHV-4, equine herpes virus 1 and 4, are highly prevalent viruses. These are viruses that are widespread in all population of horses. They generally cause a self-limiting upper airway infection. 99.9% of the diseases associated with EHV-1 is, again, I'm going to repeat that, in a self-limiting upper airway infection. And that will affect young horses. Your weanling, your yearling, 2-year-old, a little bit of fever, they go off feed, they have snotty nose and maybe swollen lymph node, and that's it. Unfortunately, in certain instances, we see complications. These complications are devastating. The virus gets in the bloodstream and then travels through the pregnant uterus. It can cause abortion. Or if it travels to the blood vessel of the central nervous system, it can cause the neurological disease. We define this neurological disease as equine herpes virus 1 myeloencephalopathy, or EHM. Next slide, please. As Steve mentioned, and that's the curse of EHM, this disease occurs at the tail end of an infection. There's somewhere 10 to 14 days after the horse has experienced fever and maybe mild respiratory sign, and suddenly that horse has an acute onset of weakness, becomes incoordinated, has urinary incontinence, goes down. Most of these horses have spinal cord signs, and I would say 50 to 60% of these horses will not recover, will have to be humanely destroyed. Occasionally, the virus will also affect brain or brain stem. Next slide, please. 2022 was a very bad year for outbreak, and I tell you how, from a single index case, we end in over 116 cases, and how it affected the industry. Steve has eloquently spoken about the first index case, elegantly handled at the showground, perfectly done, isolated quarantine, state official intervene, there was quarantine and monitoring. What the issue is, by the time you see a horse with neurological disease, there is many more horses that have been infected. Some of them may carry the virus shedding without developing clinical disease. Others will develop either EHM or what we call EHV-1 infection, which is fever and respiratory sign. From that single case, we have a connection with a total of 21 premise. So these are horses that experience EHV-1 infection. They were in contact directly or indirectly with horses that went to the show. Involved a total of 10 counties affected 116 horses. 11 of these horses had EHM, so the neurological form, and 6 of them had to be humanely destroyed. So a fatality rate of 54%. I mean, that's really dramatic. The quarantine, not at the horse park, but the quarantine associated with all these outbreaks was actually released end of April. Now you may ask yourself, well, why is it that we haven't seen any other outbreak? And this is a move that, you know, we question. USEF and the state CDFA came up to the conclusion that in order to return to competition, horses had to take a mandatory quarantine of 28 days and even being tested before going to the next show. The next show was, I believe, mid-April in Blenheim. And with this, you know, drastic resolution, we haven't seen any further outbreak. So as dramatic and financially impactful as this decision were, they were able to shortcut future outbreak. Next slide, please. EHV-1 infection, as I mentioned before, is widespread in young horses. However, we know from outbreak and studying this outbreak that in order for a horse to develop EHM, there's many factors. Factors come from the environment, from the virus, but mostly from the host, the horse itself. We know that young performance horses, female mares, are at a higher risk of developing EHM in the face of an EHV-1 outbreak. We know that these outbreaks predominantly happen during the colder month of the year. In a very nice retrospective study, I looked at the Ogden outbreak 2011 that happened in Ogden, Utah. We know that breaches in biosecurity protocol were a predisposing factor for horses to develop EHM. Tying horses outside the stall, using the wash rag, using communal water buckets, having personnel come and attend the care of horses. So that could be people from outside, a farrier, a veterinarian, any person, a breeder, a groom, any person that has movement and circulate between horse population. Now, well understood that the number of classes competed. The more often a horse has potential direct or indirect contact with other horses, the greater the risk of that horse to acquire an infectious pathogen. Next slide, please. Steve brought it up very, very well. I mean, how would you prevent? I mean, it's easy. No horses, no sick horse goes to show, first of all. And second, every sick horse, as Duncan said, that at the show develops clinical disease is a red flag, needs to be further investigated. The reality is that is a great concept. One of the big issues that we have with EHV-1 is that, first of all, not only clinically infected animals are shedding. There's a certain percentage of horses that at any given time will remain healthy, but have the possibility to shed EHV-1. Not any different than what we have experienced during COVID-19 pandemic. Some of us have been infected with that coronavirus, have been shedding it, but have never experienced clinical disease. Monitoring neurological disease is far beyond what is doable. That's the end stage of the disease. So we really need to get better on monitoring early clinical disease and reporting these horses with elevated rectal temperature. And the two key components that I believe will make a huge change in this year's show venue is, you know, biosecurity as well as communication. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end with this slide, and it's a very complex slide. It's not about the writing in the slide. You will realize that UCSF, show organizer, owners, manager, horse people have each to be involved in order to prevent the spread of EHV-1 and other respiratory pathogens. And the way I look at it, there's 3 levels. There's a level that has to be done before you go to the show. There's a level that is applicable to the time that horse spent at the show. But let's not forget horses that return back from a show. So the reality is we only want to have healthy horses go to show. That is clear. The mandatory testing of EHV-1 before going to show is not sustainable. It doesn't make much sense, but we need to recognize that a certain percentage of healthy horses going to show, and that percentage is low, it's somewhere between 0 to maybe 3%, will shed EHV-1. They'll be stressed, they'll experience a recrudescent, and they potentially can contaminate the environment and spread EHV-1 to other horses. So therefore, during the show event, the only way we can prevent the spread of these viruses is really to adhere to biosecurity protocol. So grouping horses by origin, trying to reduce traffic, mingling, increase cleanliness, hand hygiene, trying to prevent that cross movement between people and between horses. The last step is preventing spread once your horse goes home. There's many outbreaks that happened this spring, didn't affect show horses, but affect these older, more susceptible barn horses that were infected as that show horse came back home. So having protocols, and it's biosecurity, monitoring, cleanliness, and hygiene, they're really trying to separate these show horses and preventing these pathogens to be transmitted to the resident population is really essential. So I hope I didn't take too much of your time, and I'm going to pass the baton here to Eric Mendonça.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, we'll keep this pretty quick. We can go next slide. My name is Eric Mendonça. We are Fluxergy, and we are a medical device manufacturing company based in Irvine, California. I think what I can start with is, we're really grateful to be working with such great partners on this. I think, with Dr. Pasterla's group, we've been working with UC Davis for the past 5 years. Just with regards to EHV-1, just even since last year's outbreak and collecting samples that have helped for the development of this test, USEF, the group at Desert International Horse Park is really, from the beginning, it's been a team effort about making sure that everyone can compete. This layer of testing has been more so for, again, being a tool that we can quickly detect on what's going on and take action, versus limiting competition and being something that's in the way. So just a little bit about the platform. It's allows for 1 hour PCR testing of EHV-1. Like Dr. Schumacher mentioned, the state labs are still responsible for the confirmatory testing of EHV-1. And here's a little picture that we have down here of the on-site lab at Desert International Horse Park. Again, really excited to be participating in this and using this technology that we've been developing for the last better part of the decade, to help out. In terms of what's coming next, again, it's really a team effort. So we have our EHV-1 test that we're using right now and applying for USDA. But moving forward, it's about developing even a full respiratory panel and an inflammation panel using the samples, and again, the research that we're doing throughout this season. So I guess all I can say is, again, we're thankful to be working with such great partners where, the commitment is really about making sure it's a safe environment for all the competitors and the horses. I guess we can, next slide, and let's get to some questions.
All right, Eric, thank you very much. One last thing I want to make sure that we mention too before we go to the questions. We do have some questions in the queue. I was a bit reticent to mention it, but EDCC, the Equine Disease Communication Center. I just want to encourage everyone, if you're not already on there or get the alerts, you need to sign up for them. It's a great, excellent resource for disease outbreaks, cases. There's been much better integration over the last several years with the state veterinarians, really helping and advancing that disease communication center, because, as was pointed out too, you have a lot of times when people communicate by social media and they may not have all the facts. At least with the EDCC, you get that information. So I would encourage everyone on here, if you've never checked it out, you need to check it out now and sign up for the alerts and look at some of the other resources. With that, I think we have one question here. And Mark, I don't know if you want to do these or if you want.
Yeah,
me
I'm happy to jump in. Thank you to all our panelists. And, anyone who has questions, there is a Q&A feature that you can type those in, and we'll go through a few of them that came in now. First one, maybe Steve Hankin, if you want to answer it. There was a couple questions regarding a little bit more detail on the new protocols in place for arrival and during horse shows to help spread infectious disease. So maybe if you want to talk about at your venue, Desert Horse Park.
Sure. Our protocols are on our website. There's a very clear biosecurity section that has our protocols and then has the schedule of arrival and the documentation that's required. We are following a simple philosophy, which is if your horse is sick, don't bring it, and then trying to find them on the property as quickly as possible. So we have a requirement that's new this year for documentation for arrival. It includes a declaration of health, a veterinary certificate, and a vaccine confirmation. And I think there was a question about resources. So we do have a dedicated biosecurity officer, David Runk, who's been super. He is a vet. His responsibility is completely separate from East West, who is the show vet of record and cares for the horses on the property. David is there to implement our program. And so he's making sure that all the horses that come on the property meet the requirements. And then, as simple as it is, on each stall door is a temp chart and a number. We do require people to temp. And part of David's job is to run around each day and try to enforce that as much as possible. And also the number on the stall so that we know exactly what horses are where. We do know that, that we can, for many of the cases, we can track the movement of people and horses between barns. And so, the challenge with some of the protocols, as they seem simple, which is avoid nose-to-nose contact between horses. And I used to call Duncan and Stephen and Nicola all the time and say, well, how do I do that? And some of it's just awareness of just keeping horses separate. We're providing towels at the ring to prevent if your groom runs out of a towel, he can grab one rather than borrowing one. So some of those protocols are simple, but a lot of this is about cleanliness, keeping horses separated, and tracking the health of horses while they're on the property. But they're very detailed and they can be found on our website.
Great, thank you, Steve. And regarding some of the other venues, I would encourage everyone to take a look at those horse show websites for up-to-date information, sort of as far as what their protocols would be regarding that. Next question was regarding the EDCC alerts and how someone signs up for those. So I think, Stephen, you had mentioned that. Whoop, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was going to type the answer, but I hit the wrong button. Well, I wanted to.
Oh, got it. I saw it pop up there for me. So
yeah, the EDCC. The link is hold on here. Just it is www.equinediseasecc.org. So that's all you need to do is go to that website. There's easy explanation as to how to sign up for the alerts. They have resources as far as reportable diseases in individual states, biosecurity, disease information, how to report disease alerts themselves. And then also it has equine microchip lookup. There's a whole host of information, but that's really the best central communication system for getting the hard facts. As we saw in California this past spring, the state veterinarian's officer, Dr. Natsiba, they would report their findings and to the EDCC. So it was put out in one central clearinghouse, but definitely look at that website.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Next question here. Has there been any evaluation of air clearance systems like that have been used in indoor situations during the COVID outbreak situation at equine show venues? Not sure.
We have not. We evaluated some blue light technologies. But it's relatively difficult to, well, I would put this in the category of a lot of information isn't known, and there aren't tests on this. We are doing a lot of stall testing right now, before and after horses, to understand the prevalence of the disease that goes undetected. And then we can possibly explore technologies, more broadly, but when we looked at the blue light technologies, they're very difficult to actually use in this environment.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Sort of a technical question here. Are EHV-1 viruses that result in EHM different from other EHV-1 virus?
I may answer that one. The short answer is no. There is one virus, EHV-1, and that virus can cause all the different form of disease that we know. The most common one being the respiratory disease. Occasionally, it can cause abortion as well as neurological disease. But you have to look at one virus that has various disease forms as an outcome.
Great, thank you. Regarding, there's a question here, what would be the suggested size for a quarantine area for an equine facility? Are there general guidelines that are out there that people should be following?
There are, one thing I'd say is there actually requirements in USEF for the size, but one thing that is very relevant is if you're at our place, you'll see two different tents. We have a pre-isolation facility and an isolation facility. It proved very valuable to separate horses. Once we learned that a horse that tested negative could potentially test positive later, we left them in pre-isolation and only put positive cases in isolation. So that's why in our place, you'll see two facilities, one for pre-isolation, one and we, despite whatever rules there were, we wound up putting a lot more tents up to meet the requirement. It's so.
Sure, thank you. Another question here, you mentioned it reminds me a bit of how people did their rapid COVID test before going places in the era of the pandemic. Is there a similar approach with horses, as in people will do a rapid test when they arrive at a horse park or a show venue, or only if they have symptoms will they go ahead and take the test?
Duncan or Eric?
Maybe Nick in terms of
Yeah.
testing, or Duncan, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually talked about that as a potential possibility, but when you think about it, it's a little bit overwhelming. And at the same time, it is quite intensive in terms of holding people up, slowing things down, and having a facility where people could keep their horses, a holding facility for the test to come back, that type of thing. And we decided against it. We've talked about the incidents here. I think more importantly is probably not putting a sick horse on the trailer. Occasionally horses will come off the trailer sick, we know that, but for the most part, I think diligence at the start, we felt that we didn't need to do that at this point in time to keep that under control.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Next question, we just have a couple more. I know we're right at top of the hour, so I think we'll get through these last three that we have in the queue and then wrap up today's webinar. And then any other questions obviously can be sent in via email and we can help get answers to those. So next one, is there anything known about medications, including dexamethasone, being a risk factor for EHV or for developing neuroscience once the horse has EHV?
I'll give you the preview, and then Duncan and Nicola can answer it. The preview is we had 29 horses on the property that got sick. 27 of them were ponies or hunters. Only 2 of them were jumpers. So there's clearly, and we had a very disproportionate number of ponies. So there's clearly something in the different that we don't know, but we don't have any answers to that, I would say. But Duncan, you probably have a point of view.
I have a point of view, and I think, yes, anytime you suppress the immune system on these horses, you open the door for other problems. And so, dexamethasone certainly can do that. Dexamethasone is a great anti-inflammatory, though, too. And we do use that in cases of neuro cases. So it's a double-edged sword there. But I think horses that are on corticosteroids for extended periods of time through these circuits certainly have the risk of not being able to handle some of the infectious agents that come along. Nicola?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's one of the questions that a graduate student is trying to answer right now is the use of corticosteroids. As Duncan mentioned, corticosteroids are used as very potent anti-inflammatory to treat horses with EHM. But on the other side, these drugs can immunocompromise an animal, not that it would necessarily increase the susceptibility, but what we have seen with steroids and EHV-1 is it can cause a recrudescence of a latent stage, not any different than herpes zoster in humans. When humans become stressed, they suddenly have a flare-up of an infection. So the continuous use of immunosuppression can potentially predispose horses without developing clinical disease to shed and then transmitting EHV-1 to other susceptible horses. There's another drug that we need to consider, and that's an observation that mares apparently are more susceptible to develop EHM than geldings. The drugs are towards cycle inhibitors, and some of these cycle inhibitors have an immunosuppressive effect. And so these are all factors that we need to have population large enough to study to come up with a yes or no answer. There is, on the other side, one product that is worthwhile considered in the prevention in the multi-state outbreak that Dr. Drab-Dorgetz investigated. The use of supplement with zinc that contains zinc appear to be protective in mitigating EHM as an outcome, and it's been shown that zinc has an antiviral effect. So actually, a great example where investigation of an outbreak actually led to a positive outcome and a piece of information that now we can use in order to help these horses.
Great, thank you all. Two more quick questions. Next one, unfortunately, the individual who sent this in just lost a mare about a month ago, actually, to EHV-1. She's been working through protocols, isolating, separating horses. Her question was regarding how long can the virus remain on people's clothes?
The short answer is we don't know. It depends. It's not just the virus. It's ambient temperature, it's humidity, is where is the virus wrapped in nasal secretion. It depends also on the material the snot with the virus is deposited. I would say hours to a few days, but it's highly dependent. It also depends on how much virus the animal is actually shedding. But in general, and that's why we don't see these outbreaks in the summertime, hot ambient temperature, dryness, simple environmental ways to kill this virus.
Great, thank you. And last question for the evening. Is
Actually,
there a
Mark-
vaccine?
actually,
Oh,
Mark-
go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The other part of that question too, I think also identified the fact that and again, sorry for your loss, but that the horse was on a grounds or a location where they didn't have any horses in or out for a number of years. And so I think it's important to also point out that as was discussed earlier, this disease can also recrudesce. And so you don't always have to have, one horse bring it in and give it to another, where it can recrudesce in a stable environment where there are no horses in or out, and those horses can be subsequently infected. So I think that's also important to note. And that's why this is an endemic disease. So I'll just leave it at that.
No, thank you for jumping in with that. That's great. And last question is just, is there a vaccine for EHV-1?
There are vaccines for EHV-1. These vaccines are aid in the prevention of respiratory disease and to some extent abortion. Not a single EHV-1 vaccine has a claim for the protection of EHM, and I'm leaving it to that.
Great, thank you. So thank you all to participants for joining and asking some great questions, and panelists this evening for joining. The session is being recorded, so we will have it on our website, usef.org, so that you can go back, and if there's anything you want to reference or share with others, you can do so. Steve, I don't know if you have any final thoughts before we close out tonight.
No, I think the message has been carried, and hopefully we may have another webinar in the beginning of January before things really start ramping up, just to remind everyone of what's going on and be alert and be vigilant. And remember, look to the EDCC as well for information. And then lastly, as someone said before, I think we need to start printing t-shirts that said, "Don't be a fomite." So also be considerate of not transmitting disease between horses yourself. And so everyone plays their own role. But thank you again.